All right, so for those of you who don't know, I'm not Roger Wilkinson, who usually chairs these sessions. I'm Kim Humphrey. I'm the current president of TASA, and I, offer you a warm welcome on behalf of TASA, and of course a warm welcome to Raewyn. Uh, just before we go any further ahead, I just want to acknowledge country. I'm down in Naarm in Melbourne, on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi people of the Kulin Nation. And as TASA always does, we pay our respects to uh, Wurundjeri elders past, present and rising. And I extend that respect to any First Nations colleagues here today. And you're quite free to put in the chat where you are and when you want to speak, just acknowledge country. So these Thursday sessions, as I've said, are usually chaired by Roger. Roger can't be here, so I've jumped in with very great pleasure, I have to say, into the role. And of course, today's speaker is Raewyn Connell, Professor Raewyn Connell. Now, I thought about how to introduce you, Raewyn, and I realised that you just need, particularly in an Australian context, you need no introduction at all, but I'm going to give you one, given your influence over many decades on theory and practice with Australian sociology or sociology in Australia. I'm not quite sure what Australian sociology might be, but we do sociology here, and you've been a real influence on that, and of course globally as well. Now, just for people's information, Raewyn was foundation professor at Macquarie University in 1976, I think, and built up the school there. Has also had appointments at the University of California and at Sydney for many, many years. And currently, Raewyn's status as Professor Emerita is with Sydney Uni. We all know Raewyn for her work, very varied work on class, on gender relations, on education, on, of course, masculinities, and more recently for her work on the sort of the Northern Hemisphere dominance of social theoretical knowledge and the way in which she's introduced us to a better understanding of social theory beyond the Northern Hemisphere. Given that kind of breadth of work and that impact, Raewyn has, as many people here will know, has been the recipient of numerous international and national awards for her contribution to sociology. And I'm glad to say has had a really long association with TASA, being TASA president in 1987 and 1988. I don't know if you remember that role, but it's an ongoing one, and I'm enjoying it immensely. I'm sure you did too. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Raewyn here today to talk about her new and much awaited book, Trans Lives, Social Relations Across the Globe. So please join me in welcoming Raewyn.
Okay, thank you, Kim, and thank you to everyone who's come to this meeting. I'm getting sort of little balloons and hands floating across the screen, which is charming. Thank you for all of that.
There's Rayleigh.
How's that?
No, wait.
Okay. Here's the book that we're going to be talking about. The distributors have told me that the Australian distributors, that is, Wiley, have told me that they have sold out of the book, which may be why it's a little hard to get at the moment, but fear not, more are on the sea as we speak, and are supposed to be turning up next month. I want to start out with a couple of points about why I wrote this, and then go on to some of the arguments in it, and hopefully I hope to leave enough time for real Q&A and shouts of outrage as appropriate. This is a book I was reluctant. I've written more than 20 books as author or co-author, and this is the one that I was most reluctant to write. Trans people in general, and trans women, I guess, especially, are very often required to explain themselves to friends, family, doctors, officials, border guards, police, and so on and so forth. It can be wearing. It can be an intrusion on privacy. It can, in some circumstances, be dangerous. So it's understandable that some are reluctant to place themselves in a visible position or attract attention, I suppose, to oneself. But the situation has changed over the last 15 years or so. There has been a surge of anti-trans aggression in much of the world, from religious institutions, from political leaderships, from authoritarian governments, from the radical right, from militias, from crazies of one kind or another. And that surge of aggression has placed very considerable psychological stress on a lot of trans groups and produced material harms as well. So it's something that matters and I think needs a response. And I felt some responsibility to help with that response. Since I seem to have some of the qualifications for it, I've done research on gender issues over a period of time. I was able to travel and meet trans groups in a variety of countries, about 12 countries, in fact. And I know how to write. And have some of the resources that are needed. So that's why I felt obliged to stick my oar in a situation that is in some ways certainly uncomfortable. But what I try to do in the book is give an account of trans lives, of the nature of transition itself, that tries to get beyond what I think of as the main paradigm that operates in discussions of trans matters, including the statements and speech of trans groups themselves. That paradigm may be a little bit exaggerated to call it a paradigm, but anyway, it's a style of thinking and speaking about trans issues that highlights issues of identity, sees trans identities as fundamentally as violating gender norms, so it's engaged in some kind of combat in the normative sphere, and particularly constructs trans lives as subverting social norms. But I want to get beyond that, which I think leads us into some difficulties conceptually and politically. And my tool for doing that basically is sociology. Sociology of daily life, for instance. So looking at the evidence that I've been able to gather from ethnographic studies of trans groups, from autobiographies and from a variety of other sources. We're mainly looking at conditions, lives being put together, being lived in poverty, in global north as well as in global south. Conditions of precarity, including precarious health and housing, as well as economic precarity, and conditions that are often in context of quite serious violence and aggression. And they raise issues of organising and of understanding that go a long way beyond questions of identity and subversion. One of my tools for beginning to understand trans lives in different circumstances is in effect industrial sociology. In a way, this book is an industrial sociology of trans lives. It treats transition as something requiring work, as something requiring a workforce. Workforces as constructed in social context, in relation to social structures, the tools that we normally use to understand situations in sociology. So that's the kind of approach that I have taken. It requires me to be critical of some of the language, some of the quite familiar language that's come to be used about trans lives. For instance, the concept of cisgender as an opposite to transgender, where cisgender represents normativity, people who live according to official gender norms, so to speak. We're talking about 99% of the population here, and I have certain difficulty thinking of 99% of the population as a homogeneous mass. I begin to wonder if we've forgotten what Freud taught us about the tensions and contradictions within normative gender relations and personalities constructed within familiar social settings, such as the patriarchal family, and so forth. So I'm very much uncomfortable with the framework that requires us to oppose, if you like, trans lives to cis lives. I want to think it's important, actually, to emphasize what those groups have in common, what are the gender tensions and possibilities for change in what that framework calls cis lives, as well as trans lives. And similarly, I'm very uncomfortable with the term transphobia, which has come to be almost universal in trans discourse to describe hostility and opposition. The idea of transphobia, which suggests a general negativity, hostility towards trans groups because of the majority's acceptance of gender normativity, it seems to me locates, if you like, well, to put it crudely, it takes the heat off the perpetrators. It takes attention away from the right-wing politicians, the ultra-conservative religious leaders, and so forth, who've been producing anti-trans and anti-gender activism over these 15 years or so on a much greater scale than ever before. And also, and this is something that I've come to think more recently, that isn't stated in an obvious way in the book, it takes attention away from the radicalism of some of this hostility, which systematically denies not just respect to trans people, but their right to exist. You will find denied in some of the religious discourse and some of the political discourse and some of the practices too. So I'm dissatisfied, therefore, with the way that discussions around trans issues have principally been carried on. I want to bring us back to attention to gender as a social structure, to the problem of social embodiment rather than simply identity conceived in opposition to biology or biological reproduction, to bring us back, in fact, to historicity as a condition of human social life, and as something that, in fact, is a feature of our existence as social beings. That's the, if you like, the intellectual framework that seems to be more adequate to understanding the real detail of what's been happening around trans groups. Okay, it won't surprise you that I have also tried, in a sense, to decolonize the discussion of trans lives, which has been very much dominated by ideas generated from the United States and responding to conditions, social relations and politics within the United States. So a significant part of the book, in fact, is an attempt to tell the story of trans groups living in some ways similar, in some ways different lives to those of trans groups in the global north, and to dramatize this by giving some specific cases that need attention. I'll very briefly mention three of these. One is Iran, very much in the news at the moment, where almost uniquely in the world, trans people have religious permission for transition as a result of a fatwa by the Ayatollah Khomeini himself, the supreme leader of the Iranian Republic in its early days. Not only is there religious support for gender transition, but there's state support too. It's enabled through a very interesting bureaucracy. Now, this is not to say that Iran is a wonderful place for trans groups or trans women in particular to live, given what we know about the misogyny of the regime and the homophobia of the regime. But it is a very distinctive situation that is worth thinking about because it has implications for the kind of politics that might develop out of trans experience. Whether this situation will survive the aggression that's going on currently from the Trump regime is very hard to tell, but it's a situation that nevertheless should be part of our knowledge of trans existence. Then I think it's also important to think about India, where trans groups have existed, have had a public existence from pre-colonial times, and through colonial times as well, despite some opposition from the colonial state. And we're quite recently, in fact, in 2019, the regime passed a law which, unlike legislation about trans conditions in other parts of the world, set out to create a kind of third gender legal category that Hijra, Aravani, Koti, other gender transitioning or gender variant groups could opt for to give them a distinctive status in the Indian state and in the Indian legal regime. Again, how this would survive, to what extent this is accepted, this makes sense in local contexts among India's very large Muslim population, for instance, or in tribal contexts is not at all clear as yet, but the fact that there is a different legal situation for trans groups, or at least it is available to trans groups there, is again part of our part of the knowledge we need if we're going to take genuinely global approach to these issues. And finally, I want to come to Australia and say something about that. Of course, I mean, our language for talking about trans issues mostly derived from the United States, and we are politically, of course, closely tied to the United States in many ways. But still, there are some rather distinctive things about Australia. For instance, Australia is where the most, to my mind, the most brilliant novel about trans lives emerged. It's a book, this book by Patrick White, The Twyborn Affair, came out in 1979, as I remember, one of White's later novels, one of his great ones, I think. And there's nothing like that, nothing as profound or as, to me, as moving that I've seen in the literature, in literary productions about trans issues from anywhere else in the world. Australia is also one of the very first important ethnographies of trans lives emerged. The drag queen scene set in King's Cross in the late 70s and early 80s, published in 1983 by Roberta Perkins, who became a very central character in Australian trans activism, who has now passed away, I'm sorry to say, but has left us a terrific book that documents a moment in the emergence of a collective, if you like to use the term identity, let's use it collectively, collective presence of trans groups in the life of Sydney. So there's a global diversity as well as gender diversity in this story, and they, I think, are important to recognize and to build from if we're going to build an adequate understanding of trans lives and their position, if you like, in the larger social order. So I'm trying to pull this together a little. The picture I want to draw of trans existence in a world as turbulent and violent as ours is, both connected and divided on a global scale, is of lives that are mostly precarious, but not abject. Looking closely at trans lives, including autobiographies, interview studies, ethnographic studies, and so forth, there are a lot of capacities here, even in the most difficult of situations. There's creativity in the process in the work of transition itself, and in the organising that we see. There's quite an impressive record of organising of trans groups, transport groups, cultural groups, and so on and so forth, even in contexts of poverty and violence. And there's intellectual work too. There is some Southern theory here, which is worth paying attention to, some coming from India, of course, given its long history in this area. Some also coming from Argentina through the work of trans groups such as travesti authors, Lahana Birkins, Marlena Wayat, I think intellectual contributions that should be seriously studied and recognized by anyone interested in developing a global picture of these issues. So, folks, that's what I wanted to say to lay out a bit of the territory beforehand. I will shut up now and to make space, we hopefully have a reasonable time for discussion, for questions, criticisms, howls of outrage, and anything else you want to throw in.
You don't have to shut up Really, I think we'd all love you to go on talking forever. But yeah, I've got lots of things running around in my head, but I'm sure other people have as well. And I'm not going to have a conversation between you and me now. So, are there questions that people want to uh, uh, address to Raewyn or observations? You can put them in the chat, or you can just put your hand up and put your mic on. Come on, be the first. Judith. Rob, Judith? I think your mic's off.
Congratulations, Raewyn, both for the book, which we've ordered some months ago, but it still hasn't arrived. So I suspect it's caught somewhere in the Straits of Hormuz or somewhere.
Like that.
I just finished reading a really interesting essay in the latest London Review of Books I've got here in Melbourne. And it addresses the sort of value of going back to psychoanalysis. And I was intrigued that you made some quick reference to the psychoanalytic tradition. And this is an exploration of why is there so much aggression directed at trans people in particular, and what does that reveal about the politics, if you like, of the trans experience and the emergence, as you would say, of an industrial scale project. I'm just wondering if you wanted to elaborate a bit more on that, or you don't have to, but I'm interested in that because it does take us to the dark space of irrationality and the Freudian and post-Freudian capacity to shine some light on that in a very interesting and I think important way.
Yeah. Mentioning irrationality is highly relevant because, I mean, if we're thinking about what's happening in the world at the moment, what many of us are so deeply concerned with is the surge of the political right and of extreme versions of right-wing politics in recent years. And certainly the anti-trans aggression is part of this. Indeed, it's a small part. There are more important parts. But it does take me back to the interwar period when sociologists first began to grapple with the problem of surges of right-wing politics, in this case in the form of fascism. One of the tools that they reached for, of course, was psychoanalysis, which had come to popular attention just a generation before. So I'm thinking of the work of people like Karl Mannheim, for instance, in trying to understand what was happening in the 1930s. He was one of the people who had to flee from Germany, of course, at the time of the fascist takeover. He used that in combination with ideas from socialism, from mainstream sociology of the day, to understand what he took as a surge of irrationality in global politics, which of course in fairly short order led to war and genocide. And that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in psychoanalysis, in thinking about all of these issues. But also it leapt to mind when I began grappling with that concept of cisgender. If you're talking about pretty well 99% of the population, you're attributing to them, normativity, inhabiting, a set of norms and rules. You were more or less talking sex role theory again. People, older members will remember this stuff from the 1970s when we fought a long battle to overcome role theory as the dominant paradigm in sociology. And one of the tools for that was the recognition in psychoanalysis of the conflicts and contradictions that exist within so-called normal gender, a normal personality was also built on, conflict, contradiction, turbulence, repression, unconscious forces, etc. Now, we don't have to believe everything Freud said. We don't have to go back to classical psychoanalysis. But that recognition of the turbulence in normality, if you like, seemed to me tremendously important, and one that's been well supported since. So that's why I was coming back, if you like, to that language as a way of grappling with difficulties in gender. And I don't think there were psychoanalysts who tried to understand trans existence in psychoanalytic terms, and I've read a deal of that literature. It never became very convincing, I don't think, because it was so by the 1950s and 60s, when this literature arose and when issues about trans were first debated in public, the mainstream psychoanalysis in the United States had become culturally very conservative indeed, quite different from the time of Freud and Adler. So, unsurprisingly, their view of trans lives was of a pathological condition, and they just had to find an etiology and an explanation for it. Then you could treat them and fix their heads. Well, not many people take that view now, but by abandoning those etiologies, if you like, perhaps also we have thrown away some tools that would help us understand normality in a more convincing way. Yeah.
Thanks, Raewyn, and thanks, Rob. Any other questions or comments? I've got one, which I want to go back to the comments you had on identity, Raewyn.
Sure.
I think probably like me, you're somewhat over the kind of identity-focused nature of trans politics, which does, as you've said, come very much in the US. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily fitted into Australia terribly well because of our different political history to the US. But could you say a little bit more about alternatives to thinking of trans beyond saying you identify, or you and I identify as women, for example?
Mm-hmm.
Because you probably find those forms that say, how do you identify, as frustrating as I do, because I don't identify as a trans woman. I am one.
Yep.
So yeah, can you say a little bit more about your sense of identity politics within the Australian context, I suppose?
Sure. One of the problems with the simplified identity theory that circulates in most of these discussions is its individualism. So the online checker box, which are you transgender, trans woman, trans man, non-binary, etc., conceives your position, your gender as a personal choice and a personal construction, and it connects with, a powerful current in American culture, powerful cultural individualism, and hence with the notion of personal growth as a great value, of self-improvement through time as the way of understanding changes in your life and so forth. And the whole industry around this. We haven't had that on anything like the same scale, I guess. And there's very much more collectivism in Australian history. There's perhaps a raw experience here compared with contemporary United States rather than United States period before, a raw experience of coloniality, of, on the one hand, the dispossession of Indigenous people as something that's part of living memory, and of dependence on the metropole, particularly on Britain, which was such a live area, such a live issue in Australian culture, half a century ago. And I guess now is mixed up with our relationship with the United States. But certainly some of the material that I talk about in the book, especially the historical material, does perhaps fit with a concern about, if you like, collective identity more than individual identity. So it's interesting to me that when Roberta Perkins wrote this in the early 80s, she didn't talk much about identities. And she certainly didn't use the now common term, the trans community or the LGBTIQ community. She did talk a little bit about a subculture, which was a sociological term in use at the time, thanks to the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies. And some of the historical material there and in the work of Vivian Namaste in Canada, which I talk about in the book, seems to me to speak to the emergence of collective presence, of networks, to be, social networks, to make it sociologically more concrete, which you could then speak of in terms of collective identity. But you would also have to think of the shifts in understanding the situation of trans groups now. And I use this rather neutral term, trans groups, quite a lot, so as to avoid prejudging questions around collective and individual identity. We have to think of the colonial economic situation that that our present moment in Australia has developed out of. So a dependent colonial economy in the 19th century was in which a certain construction of frontier masculinities became possible and credible as an account of what Australian men were like. Although a certain amount of that was fantasy too, there was also a material reality behind it. And then in over a period of a couple of generations of Australian history, and with a lot of state support, the economy industrialized so that a new industrial working class appeared, and with it new constructions of a breadwinner model of masculinity in an urban context that became central to what were, if you like, the normative visions of masculinity and femininity by the mid-20th century. And then, of course, that has gone into the dustbin of history as Australia deindustrialised, as we became again raw material suppliers to the world, as the industrial working class was dispersed, union density fell so that the working class collective identity has largely vanished from Australian life. These are the kinds of shifts within which trans lives have been lived. So when Australian society collectively was constructing an industrial economy and a welfare state, it became possible in Australia to imagine, as it was in the United States and in Western Europe, trans medicine as in the form of gender clinics or publicly provided medical care and educational care through public education systems and so forth. And as that, if you like, economic and social context has passed away, the language of the reality of precarity and the language of individualism began to replace earlier forms. So I'm gesturing wildly here. I mean, it would be a really splendid project to try to document and connect these lines of change. But that's why I'm trying to think always in terms of gender as embodied, all right, but social embodiment is necessarily historical, and as human life social life in general is. That's the style of work that I think will lead us to a fuller understanding of trans issues here as elsewhere.
Yeah, thanks, Raewyn. And I've now got questions appearing on the screen all over the place. So it's James and then Ollie and then Fran. And I think another question shot up somewhere.
Belinda Johnson.
Belinda, okay. So so it's James first, Ollie, Fran, and then Belinda.
Thanks, Kim, and thank you so much, Raewyn. It is really such an honour to hear you talk, and it's very, very fascinating conversation. I wonder, this is a bit of a broad question, so feel free to take it in a direction that suits you. And I'm sorry that it's a bit broad, but I would like to know how you're thinking about ideas about kind of youth and minority and majority or development. These kind of ideas about youth and gender in the broader context of anti-trans campaigning, because obviously it comes up a lot in kind of right-wing politics about protecting children. But I wonder, I just would love to hear more from you about how you think age and youth as ideas play into the political potential of trans movements, but also in structuring what we understand trans lives to be about as well.
Sure. Well, I should say for a start that most trans groups around the world are young. And that has to do, of course, with the very limited life expectancy in many of the circumstances where trans groups exist as a significant group. That's something I learned in Latin America, where I was talking to a group of young travesti trans women in Costa Rica one day, and in our conversation, the question of how long we expected to live came up, and the group talked among themselves for a while, and then said, "Well, we averaged it out, and we would expect to live to about 32." And but if we were in the next country but one where death squads were rampant at the time, it'd be more like 28. So in much of the world, if you're looking at a trans group, you're looking at young people mostly. And that, of course, mostly means people without much social power, even without the gender marginality. I am no expert actually on the medical and psychological work that's been done with trans kids. I take an interest in it, of course, but I don't pretend to have uh, uh, any kind of specialist knowledge about that. Um, I would say that I've heard many and read many life stories of trans people, and the great majority of them, some gender contradiction, some significant gender contradiction did emerge in childhood and often became acute in adolescence. That was certainly true for me, but it's a story I've heard in different forms in many parts of the world. So if we think about where and when support for people dealing with gender contradiction, either by constructing a trans life or by somehow trying to escape from it, then childhood and adolescence are relevant, unnecessarily part of what you're thinking about. To my mind, the kind of approach that was mostly being taken by parent groups and professional groups, meaning by professional groups, not just psychiatrists, but also counselors and educators, teachers, and parents, and by parent groups, before the recent rise of right-wing anti-gender ideology, was in fact reasonably good. They were dealing with difficult issues, undoubtedly, but they were dealing with it in a relatively calm way. There were professional differences, of course. There were over the nature of what they were dealing with and what were appropriate ways of dealing with it. You expect that, of course. But the outcomes did not seem often to be disastrous. And we could, it is basically the right-wing ideologues who have stirred this up and made it a tense set of issues, ones where people are acting when they are acting under some kind of threat. And of course, now in Queensland, under legal threat. And we can see, who created this situation quite clearly. So I think that may sound odd to deal with it. One of the ways of making things better in childhood and youth is by conducting political struggle against the people who've fucked this up, basically. Yeah.
Thanks, Raewyn.
Thanks, Raewyn. We've got we might have to go a little bit over time if that's okay with people, just to get through some questions. Ollie, you were next in the line, I think. You still with us? Yeah, you are. There you are. Ollie.
Yes. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Raewyn. I've had a chance to pick up your book, and it's great. And as someone who does work in trans lives in Australia, it's really great to hear you and to have read of this. I was wondering if you could talk a little more, kind of to what Kim asked earlier, around the concept you bring up of gendered social embodiment and how sociology and the social sciences more broadly could be thinking more broadly with trans rather than just as an identity, but how we might be conceptualizing this that allows us to do more with it in an academic and theoretical way as well.
Concept of social embodiment is my current version of a long discussion that I've been involved in. I suppose since I began trying to become a sociologist, dealing with the relationship between biological processes and social processes. And of course, when I began, that was conceived of in those interminable disputes about the explanation of psychological characteristics were that did they come from nature or from nurture? That was the language that was used, and that became an issue around gender, especially when the concept of sex roles was at its height. And a sociological approach was then thought of as an approach that defined gender norms and explained the socialization of children into those gender norms. That was the sociology in the dominant sociological perspective on gender in the 50s and 60s. Now, what happened there was that basically bodies were cut out of it, and sociologists were pitted, and social constructionism was pitted against biological essentialism. So the biology was more or less forgotten, and I want to bring it back. Indeed, I want to bring it back as evolution, biological evolution. Forgetting the mistake that 19th century sociology made of thinking you could take the concept of evolution from biology and put it into society and talk about social evolution, which made for the distinction between primitive societies and advanced societies and all that rot, which became very readily turned into racism. But I want us to understand the social life as historically emergent out of biological evolution with the development of the apes and the human ancestors and so forth, where the dominant process of change in life on Earth over the 3 billion years that life had existed on Earth became increasingly mixed with and then outpaced by the dynamic of society. And that is what's happened over the last 500,000 years. And we became, as a result of social organizations, social institutions, language, social labor, able to change our environments, intervene in the process of evolution and so forth. So that's what I mean by social embodiment, is the dependence of the social on biological life, and now the dependence of human biological life on the social, because we literally cannot live outside society now. We die if we didn't have our social means of producing food, shelter, healthcare, childcare, and education and so forth. So that's I mean, it's a very generalized concept, I agree. But if we think of embodiment, of social embodiment as a form of historical existence, it allows us to be more comfortable with all the many forms of transformation and transition that exist within it. We don't value stasis, fixity, let alone fixed identity, as something that's valuable. But we're always concerned with what we are, how we are transforming the world and society with it. I'm sorry, that's a very generalized answer, but that is crystallized in my mind, I guess, as I've been thinking about these issues as a ground, if you like, for looking at specificities like the practical issues in trans lives and in non-trans lives as well.
Kim, you're on mute.
Okay, we're actually on time. We're 1:30, but we've got Fran and Belinda with questions to ask, and I'm sure they'll be good questions. So if you're happy to go on for another 5 or 10 minutes, is that okay?
Oh, sure.
But before we do, I know some people will have to leave. So before they do, please let's just thank Raewyn for today and congratulate her on a book. We all want it. So I think you've probably got some more to say to that. Policy Press, remember. So thank you so much. And we'll continue on with the questions. So over to you,
Okay.
Fran.
Thank you, Raewyn, very much for the talk today. And also, I'm waiting on your book to arrive as well, but I'm sure it'll be worth waiting for. My question is, I pick up on a comment you made earlier about cisgender and about the 99% of the population that that come under the heading of the normal forms of gender. And I just wonder whether your ideas about gender and transgender can be extrapolated to look at that kind of heterogeneity within the cisgender category. And I wonder, are you thinking there about the kind of the reflexiveness of some of us who come under that 99% category, where we recognize the stereotypical gender roles, etc., and are trying to live our lives in a different way?
Sure.
Is that the kind of conceptual framework that you're playing with, or
Absolutely, yes.
the wrong tree?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mightn't have put it very well because I was sort of galloping a bit, but I was introducing that notion of the 99% as normal, really to suggest how incredible that concept is. To my mind, the cis versus trans framework is simply not useful at all in understanding either of the notional groups that are referred to. So, to my mind, the idea that that there's normality and then there's this subversive group really misrepresents what the lives of the majority of the population are like. Of course, there's huge diversity and multiple ways. I mean, I've spent a good part of my academic career trying to persuade people that there are multiple forms of masculinity out there, not just one male role. Likewise with femininity. I mean, ways of living one's life as a woman are multiple and contradictory. There are contradictions within anything that you could point a finger at and classify as normal. So the possibilities of living socially just lives, of bringing up children in decent rather than oppressive ways are multiple and well documented too in the literature on different forms of child raising, different forms of gender in childhood and adolescence. So yes, I'm in no sense adopting the cis versus trans model. I'm suggesting that it is actually empirically incredible and politically damaging.
Thank you.
Thanks, Raewyn. I think Belinda might have had to go. Are you still here with us, Belinda? I don't think she is. So
No, I think she's left us.
no, okay. So we might draw it to a close there.
Okay.
But yes, I just hope the Trump administration doesn't learn that there's a boatload of your books out there somewhere. But thanks so much again. Congratulations again.
Okay.
I think those of us who haven't seen the book yet are very much looking forward to it.
Right.
Okay. Thanks, Raewyn.
Okay.
And Kim, I just want to draw your attention to the details
sorry.
of
good.
Raewyn's book launch,
Yeah, good.
which will be at the Emporium on the 27th of May at 6 p.m. in Lonsdale Street, if anyone wants to go have a look.
Thank you.
And then also on the website is the website for where anyone can order Ray's book if they haven't been able to find it.
Yep. Cool.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining in.
Indeed.